you hear that? Something's out there. If you want to find out what happens next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. And in the comments, let me know what you would do in a situation like that. The wind howled as Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood before the crumbling facade of the forgotten church. The massive, weathered doors loomed before him, ajar as if inviting him into the depths of its sacred mystery. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the creak of the doors as he stepped inside. The sanctuary was a cavern of decay. Faded murals depicted scenes of angels and demons locked in eternal battle. Cryptic carvings adorned the walls, their symbols unfamiliar yet unsettling. The pews, coated in dust, faced an altar where a withered Bible lay open, its pages frozen mid-turn. The air carried the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. Marcus's curiosity overpowered his unease as he approached the altar. His fingers grazed the carvings, the cold stone biting at his skin. He deciphered fragments of Latin, words that spoke of protection and warning. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. He froze, heart pounding, as the flicker of candlelight danced across the walls, yet no candles burned. Near the altar, a trapdoor caught his eye, its edges concealed beneath the crumbling tiles. With trembling hands, he pulled it open. The heavy door groaned, revealing a steep staircase spiraling into the darkness below. Marcus hesitated, but a voice, a faint, sorrowful whisper, called his name. Against every instinct, he descended. The basement was a labyrinth of shadow and stone. Ancient relics lined the walls, chalices, crosses, and books bound in cracked leather. At the center stood a sealed chamber, its door marked with symbols identical to those upstairs. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as Marcus approached. Suddenly, the symbols flared with crimson light, and the chamber's door swung open. A figure emerged, a priest, his eyes hollow and glowing with an unnatural fire. "You shouldn't have come," the priest rasped, his voice echoing with centuries of anguish. The church trembled as shadows spilled from the chamber, writhing like living smoke. Marcus turned to flee, but the whispers became a deafening roar, pulling him back toward the chamber. The last thing he saw was the priest's outstretched hand as darkness engulfed him. Dr. Marcus Caldwell's heart raced as his eyes fixed on the trapdoor in the center of the altar. The air around it felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The rest of the church had been decayed and forgotten by time, but this hidden passage, it felt alive. His fingers trembled as he gripped the cold metal ring embedded in the wood. With a creak that echoed through the silent sanctuary, the trapdoor swung open, revealing a staircase that spiraled into the abyss below. A chill ran down his spine, but the lure of discovery was too great to resist. Marcus descended, his breath shallow in the oppressive darkness. The stairs were steep, the wood groaning beneath his weight, as if warning him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched before him, a sprawling room filled with ancient relics. Shelves lined the walls, their contents covered in a thick layer of dust. Old books, tarnished chalices, and worn-out tapestries littered the space. Yet, it was the sealed chamber at the far end that caught Marcus's attention. The room hummed with an eerie energy, one that sent a shiver crawling up his spine. The door to the chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light, as if alive. He stepped closer, drawn to it by an invisible force. His fingers brushed against the cold stone, and a sharp jolt of energy surged through him. The room seemed to breathe, the walls pulsing with the energy that emanated from within. Suddenly, the whispers returned, faint at first, like a soft murmur, but growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the very walls, the floor, the air. "You shouldn't have come," they hissed. "Leave before it's too late." But Marcus couldn't stop himself. The pull was too strong, too overwhelming. He reached for the door, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the symbols. The moment his hand made contact, the door shuddered and slowly creaked open. A rush of cold air poured out from the chamber, as if the room had been sealed for centuries. Inside, the shadows writhed, taking on strange, distorted shapes. The air itself seemed thick with malevolent energy, as if something, or someone, was watching him. Before he could step inside, a voice echoed through the chamber, deep and guttural. "You have freed me." The ground trembled beneath his feet. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something darker, more ancient. As the door swung open wider, Marcus realized with a sickening horror that he had just unleashed something that had been waiting for centuries. As Marcus stepped further into the basement, the very air seemed to shift, heavy with the stench of forgotten rituals. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers across the room. The relics around him, old books, tarnished statues, and forgotten trinkets, spoke of a history shrouded in darkness. But it was the sealed chamber at the far end that now held his undivided attention. The door groaned as it creaked open wider, revealing the cursed space within. The air grew colder with every step, and the hairs on Marcus's neck stood on end. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing in the cold, stale air, waiting. Inside, the walls were lined with rows of religious relics. Candles long extinguished, broken crucifixes, and what looked like centuries-old scrolls. In the center of the room, a large stone altar sat shrouded in thick, unnatural shadows. But it wasn't the altar that caught Marcus's attention. It was the single, dusty tome resting on a pedestal beside it. The book's cover was embossed with dark symbols, symbols Marcus couldn't comprehend, but ones that exuded a sense of dread that twisted in his gut. He slowly approached, reaching out, his fingers trembling. As his hand brushed against the pages, a sudden, oppressive force gripped his chest, making it hard to breathe. His heart raced as the room seemed to pulse around him, the air thick with an unholy presence. A voice, low and guttural, echoed through the space. "You are too late." Marcus froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The shadows around him twisted, coiling like serpents. His flashlight flickered again, revealing a figure, a dark, indistinct form that seemed to seep from the very walls of the chamber. It was the unmistakable shape of something ancient, malevolent, something that had been trapped for centuries. The book fell open to a page, and Marcus's eyes widened as he read the faded text. The priest, Father Lucian, had bound the evil within these walls, sacrificing his very life to keep it from escaping. His blood stained the altar, and in return, the entity was sealed forever. Or so he thought. A low chuckle echoed from the shadows. The entity spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers. Lucian was a fool. "You too will become part of me." Marcus stepped back, heart racing, as the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. The dark figure in front of him began to take shape. A man, but with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, his mouth a gaping void. The air thickened with an overwhelming sense of death and despair. The presence was no longer just in the room. It was inside Marcus's mind, whispering dark promises of eternal torment. His body screamed to flee, but his legs were frozen, locked in place by the entity's dark power. And then the voice whispered again, this time, sharp as a knife, "Welcome to your grave." As Marcus stumbled backward, his mind raced to piece together the horrors unfolding before him. The dark figure, the malevolent entity, seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, its form twisting into shadows like smoke, stretching and warping. It whispered, its voice slithering into his thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. "Lucian thought he could contain me," the voice hissed. "He was wrong, and so are you." The realization hit Marcus like a cold wave, crashing over him. The church wasn't abandoned, no, it had been condemned. He had thought the crumbling walls were a sign of neglect, a monument to time's decay. But the truth was far more sinister. The entity had been locked away for centuries, bound by a priest's final act of sacrifice. The church had been a prison, built to contain it, to keep it from ever seeing the light of day again. But now, Marcus had broken the seal. The ancient rituals, the carvings on the walls, the warning whispers, they had all been meant to keep the evil contained. His gaze darted to the walls, where the faint markings had started to glow with an unnatural light. The symbols, once harmless, now pulsed with power. They were no longer just warnings. They were the last barrier holding the entity in place. The air around him began to tremble, the temperature dropping rapidly. His breath came out in cold, visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the very earth was reacting to the disturbance he had caused. "You've unleashed me," the entity's voice whispered, sending chills down Marcus's spine. "The world will burn, and you will be my first servant." A wave of nausea swept over him as the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the floor beneath him cracking open like the mouth of some great abyss. He tried to run, but his legs refused to move, trapped by the dark energy that now filled the space. He dropped to his knees, his head spinning, as the weight of the truth crashed down on him. The church wasn't a place of worship. It was a prison designed to keep something locked away, something ancient and evil that had now been freed. With a final, guttural laugh, the entity's form began to grow larger, more powerful. The ground trembled violently beneath him, and the walls seemed to close in. He could hear the faint whispers of those who had come before him, their voices now lost forever to the darkness. But it wasn't just the church that was at risk. It was the world outside. Marcus had unwittingly torn open the gates of hell. And now, it was too late to stop it. The final revelation hit him. He had been the key. And now, the world would pay the price for his curiosity. It was a late evening when a group of 5 friends gathered around, their voices low with excitement and fear. They had heard the whispers, rumors of an old, forgotten asylum hidden deep in the woods, abandoned for decades. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the horrors that had taken place there, about the unethical experiments, the tortured souls, and the dark secrets that the asylum had hidden away. "Think of the stories we could tell," Jamie said, her voice eager. "It'll be the perfect thrill. It's just an old building, right?" But even as she spoke, there was a tension in the air. None of them could deny the uneasy feeling that gripped their hearts. No one had dared enter the asylum for years. It had been shut down after a series of mysterious disappearances and rumors of the staff conducting inhumane experiments on the patients. Now, it stood as a decaying relic of a twisted past. After hours of driving down narrow, overgrown roads, the group finally arrived at the asylum. The building loomed in the distance, its Gothic architecture darkened by time and neglect. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung on its hinges like a decaying mouth. "Let's do it," whispered Tom, trying to sound braver than he felt. He led the way toward the entrance, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air smelled of dampness and decay, a sign that the asylum had long been forgotten by the world. But they were about to remind it that it was still alive, in more ways than one. As they stepped inside, the floor creaked under their weight, and the walls seemed to whisper, as if the building itself was aware of their presence. The halls stretched endlessly before them, the remnants of once pristine rooms now covered in mold and dirt. Old papers were scattered across the floor, some with illegible handwriting, others with grotesque symbols that made their blood run cold. The deeper they ventured into the asylum, the darker it seemed to become. Their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jamie gasped as a door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the silence. "Did anyone else hear that?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. The only sound that followed was the pounding of their own hearts. "Let's stick together," whispered Tom. "We'll check the basement. That's where the worst experiments were done. The rumors say that's where they really went wrong." They descended into the basement, and the air grew colder with every step. The walls here were covered in strange markings, some kind of ritualistic writing, dark and ancient. As they moved deeper into the basement, they found old equipment, surgical tools, restraints, and documents detailing inhumane practices. But it was what they found next that made their blood run cold. In the corner of the room, a small, rusted cage sat beneath a flickering light. Inside was a journal, old and stained, with a name scrawled on the cover, Dr. Caldwell. It spoke of experiments, torturous procedures designed to break the human mind and spirit. The journal detailed a horrific truth. The asylum's patients were not simply treated. They were subjected to unspeakable horrors in the name of science. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and the shadows around them seemed to move, stretching toward them like living things. The walls groaned, and the sound of faint whispers filled the room. One of the friends screamed as something brushed past their face, but when they turned, there was nothing there. Panic set in. The asylum had not been abandoned. It had been waiting for them. The evil that had been unleashed by the experiments was still there, alive, hungry, and relentless. The door slammed shut behind them. The asylum wasn't just a building. It was a trap. As the group cautiously stepped deeper into the asylum, an unsettling silence engulfed them. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew, but it wasn't the decay that made their hearts race. It was the sense of something off. "It looks like no one's been here in years," Jamie whispered, her voice trembling as she shone her flashlight around the room. But her words didn't match the sight before them. The room, despite the thick layer of dust and decay, felt strangely preserved. Medical tools were still neatly arranged on metal trays, their once shiny surfaces now dull and rusted with time. Patient files were strewn across the floor, papers yellowed with age but still legible. There were charts, names, and grotesque annotations scribbled in the margins, notes about treatments that made their stomachs churn. "What the hell happened here?" Mark muttered, picking up one of the files. His fingers brushed against the paper, but the sensation felt wrong, like the ink itself had been etched with a kind of malice. They continued down the hall, their flashlights flickering as if fighting against some invisible force. The walls seemed to close in on them, each step deeper into the asylum feeling heavier, as though they were intruding on a place that had not wanted to be found. The further they ventured, the more alive the asylum felt, almost as though it had been waiting for them. The hallway twisted and turned like a labyrinth, and as they reached a large, open room, they froze. The center of the room was dominated by an old, rusted chair, its leather straps still intact, though worn with time. Surrounding it were rows of other instruments, metal tables, and contraptions that seemed far too sinister for a place of supposed healing. "Who would leave all this here?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The faint crackle of an intercom system filled the air. At first, it was just static, harmless, almost nostalgic in its broken, ancient hum. But then, a voice, distorted and strained, slipped through the static. Help me. Everyone froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of whether they had really heard it at all. The sound of the intercom crackling again sent a chill down their spines. It was louder this time, as if someone or something was trying to speak. "Escape, don't," the voice croaked, but it was too garbled to understand. It sounded desperate, like a plea for release from some unimaginable horror. Jamie's heart raced, her breath shallow. "That can't be real," she whispered, but her words were hollow, even to her. The air felt colder now, the shadows around them deeper. It was as if the asylum had become a living thing, watching them, listening to them. The once forgotten place now had a pulse, an eerie, unsettling presence that wrapped itself around their every move. With a collective shudder, they all turned toward the exit, but the doors they had entered through were gone. The hallway they had come from had vanished, replaced by more twisted corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The asylum wasn't abandoned. It had been preserved for something more sinister than they could have ever imagined. And now, there was no way out. The group had only just begun to process the strange voice over the intercom when it happened. One of them was gone. Did anyone see where Matt went? Jamie's voice trembled as she turned around, her flashlight sweeping the area. Her heart raced as she realized that their friend was nowhere to be seen. "Matt?" Tom called, his voice rising in panic. "Matt, stop messing around." But there was no answer. The only sound that greeted them was the distant echo of footsteps. Faint, hurried, almost too quiet to hear, yet unmistakably there. "He went that way," Mark said, pointing toward a narrow corridor that stretched out into the darkness. The group hesitated, the chill in the air thickening, as if the asylum itself was trying to swallow them whole. The footsteps grew louder, and without another word, they followed the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they moved through the shadow-filled halls, the light from their flashlights flickered ominously. The footsteps ahead of them quickened, but no one was there. It was as though Matt was just out of reach, playing some cruel game. "This isn't funny anymore, Matt." Jamie's voice cracked as the air grew colder. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped, and the group was plunged into an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. "Matt?" Tom called again, his voice barely a whisper. But it wasn't Matt who answered. It was a soft, guttural laugh that echoed through the hallway, sending a wave of icy fear washing over them. And then, the apparitions began. Figures emerged from the shadows. Horrible, half-formed shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were pale, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stared at the group with eyes that seemed to look right through them, as if they weren't truly there, but at the same time, they were. Mark gasped as one of the figures reached out toward him, its hand like a twisted skeletal claw. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, as if the very essence of the asylum was alive and feeding on their fear. The figures seemed to surround them, whispering things they couldn't understand, words that twisted and writhed like snakes in their minds. "Where's Matt?" Jamie screamed, her voice rising in terror. "He was right behind us. Where is he?" They searched the corridors frantically, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. Every corner they turned, every door they opened, led them deeper into a labyrinth of darkness and horror. The asylum had swallowed him whole, and the more they searched, the more they realized that they weren't just searching for a missing friend. They were searching for a way out of the nightmare that was consuming them. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the apparitions vanished. The footsteps resumed, but this time, they were distant, fading with each step, as if Matt was walking away from them. "Matt!" Tom yelled one last time, his voice breaking, but the asylum didn't answer. It just stood there silent, watching them. And They were no closer to finding their friend than when they had first started. The asylum wasn't done with him yet. It had claimed one, and now it was playing a much darker game. The deeper they went into the asylum, the more it became clear that this place was far worse than any of them could have imagined. What had started as an eerie adventure now felt like a descent into hell. With Matt still missing, their nerves were on edge, and the air around them grew thick with dread. "We need to get out of here," Jamie said, her voice shaking. She wasn't sure if she meant it as a warning or a plea. But just as they turned to head back, something caught their attention, a faint, almost imperceptible crack in the wall. "It looks like a door," Mark said, crouching down to examine it. The wall was partially hidden by layers of dirt and peeling paint, but as he pushed against it, the crack widened, revealing a hidden passage. Against their better judgment, they entered, each step filled with hesitation. The corridor they found themselves in was darker than the rest of the asylum, darker and colder, as if it hadn't seen the light of day in decades. The faintest sound of shuffling echoed from further down, and the feeling of being watched intensified. "Who would even know about this place?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The passage twisted like a snake, and the further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the very walls were closing in on them, suffocating them with the weight of their own curiosity. Finally, they reached a large, iron door. Its surface was scratched and rusted, but there was something new about it, something that didn't belong in this decaying building. Mark reached out and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a hidden wing of the asylum. What they saw inside made their blood run cold. The room was filled with rusty medical equipment, surgical tables and cages, all covered in layers of grime. But it wasn't the tools that caught their attention. It was the cold, hollow eyes of the former patients that stared back at them. The walls were covered in disturbing diagrams, sickening charts that documented horrific procedures. These weren't experiments for curing illness. These were twisted, inhumane tests meant to break the human spirit. The spirits of those who had endured the torment were still trapped here. "This is where it happened," Jamie whispered, her voice quivering with horror. "The real experiments, the ones no one talks about." As they walked deeper into the room, their flashlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breaths turning to mist in the freezing air. And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of whispers. "Help us!" The voices came from every direction, their words distorted, echoing with a pain that was almost unbearable to hear. The spirits of the patients, those who had been experimented on, tortured, and discarded, were still here, forever bound to the asylum. "We're trapped," one voice rasped, its tone filled with despair. "You'll be next." Fear clutched their hearts as the walls seemed to pulse with the energy of the restless souls that lingered there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, flicker, and move, as if the spirits themselves were rising from the very walls, watching them with eyes full of torment. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against Mark's shoulder. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The air around them grew suffocating as the spirits closed in, their chilling presence surrounding them. "We need to get out," Tom gasped, his voice filled with panic. But the door they had come through was gone. It had vanished, as if the asylum had claimed it, trapping them in the hidden wing. The walls seemed to move, to close in around them as they realized the horrifying truth. They weren't just in the asylum anymore. They were part of it. The spirits that had once been patients were now part of the asylum's dark secret, and they were never leaving. It was meant to be a peaceful hike through the dense forest, just the two of them, away from the noise of the world and into the quiet embrace of nature. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the forest in shadows, Sarah and Ben found themselves venturing deeper into uncharted territory. "We shouldn't be this far off the trail," Sarah murmured, a hint of unease creeping into her voice. But Ben, ever the adventurer, simply grinned and nudged her forward. "You always say that. It'll be fine," he reassured her, though his voice held a faint edge of uncertainty now that the path seemed to fade into nothingness. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon it, the village. At first, it looked like nothing more than a collection of decaying ruins, hidden deep within the trees. The houses, though dilapidated, stood upright, as if the village had been abandoned overnight. The walls were crumbling, windows shattered, but there was something deeply unsettling about the sight. The village felt too still, too quiet. "Ben, this doesn't feel right," Sarah whispered, her pulse quickening as she stepped closer to one of the houses. The door hung ajar, as if it had been left that way without a second thought. "Maybe they just left in a hurry." "Nothing strange about that," Ben said, though he too was beginning to feel the weight of the strange silence pressing in on them. They stepped inside. What struck them both was how normal everything looked, despite the obvious signs of neglect. Furniture, chairs, tables, even a bookshelf, was all perfectly in place, though coated in layers of dust. Personal belongings were scattered around as if the villagers had simply vanished midday, leaving everything behind. "Why would they leave everything?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The furniture, the clothes, it's like they just disappeared." Ben walked over to a table, noticing a half-eaten meal sitting there. The food had long since turned moldy, but the sight of it felt wrong, as if it had only been there moments ago. "I don't know, but it's creeping me out," Ben admitted, his carefree attitude beginning to wane. The air around them grew heavier, and the sunlight seemed to dim, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the village. Every corner they turned felt colder, and every room they explored seemed to stretch further into the decay. Then Sarah froze. "Ben," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" From somewhere deep within the village came a sound, a low, almost imperceptible murmur. It was faint at first, like distant whispers carried on the wind, but as they listened, it grew louder, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of voices. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. "Ben, we need to leave. Now." But Ben was already stepping forward, drawn by the haunting whispers, his curiosity overtaking his fear. "It's probably just the wind. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him deeper into the village, but the whispers began to change. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, unintelligible but somehow pleading. They followed the sound until they reached the center of the village, where a large, decaying tree stood. Beneath it, a stone well had been left uncovered. The whispers seemed to emanate from deep within the well, and when they peered into its depths, they saw nothing but blackness. And then there it was. A pale, skeletal hand slowly rose from the well, followed by another, and then a figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by a tattered hood. "Leave, now," a voice croaked from the figure, its voice raspy and tortured, as if it had not spoken in centuries. "You have disturbed the curse." Before they could react, the air around them grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. They turned to flee, but as they ran, the village seemed to warp around them. The houses no longer looked familiar, and every turn they took only led them deeper into the heart of the abandoned village. It was as if the village itself was alive, trapping them within its cursed walls. Finally, they stumbled out of the village, gasping for breath. The forest felt oppressive, its trees towering above them like silent witnesses. But as they turned to look back at the village, it was gone, vanished. The only trace of its existence was the chilling whispers that followed them back into the wilderness. They would never speak of it again. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. The curse of the deserted village had not been lifted, and it had claimed them both. As the daylight began to fade and the forest wrapped itself in the cold embrace of twilight, a sense of unease settled over Sarah and Ben. The village, once eerily quiet, now felt alive with a presence they couldn't explain. The air turned thick with tension, and every gust of wind seemed to carry with it an ominous whisper. "Maybe we should head back," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she glanced around the decaying houses. The oppressive silence was suffocating, and the woods surrounding the village seemed to close in on them, like a vast ocean of shadows. "I'm sure it's fine," Ben replied, though even he couldn't shake the strange feeling creeping up his spine. "Let's just explore a little longer. We came this far." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew heavier, and the world seemed to darken. It wasn't just a fading light, it was something else, something unnatural. The first whisper came when they were near the well, the place where they had discovered the skeletal figure moments before. It was a low murmur, barely audible, but the sound made the hairs on Sarah's neck stand up. She turned toward Ben, but he hadn't heard it. Or maybe he had, and just didn't want to acknowledge it. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Ben paused, straining to listen. At first, all that could be heard was the rustling of the trees, the wind sighing through the branches. But then, there it was again, a faint whisper, just beyond their hearing, as if the village itself was speaking. "Leave, leave, leave." Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. She looked around, but saw nothing. The village was still. The shadows stretched long across the ground, dark shapes that twisted and swayed as if they had a life of their own. But there were no people, no signs of movement, nothing to explain the sound. "Let's go. Now," Sarah urged, her voice growing more frantic. But Ben stood still, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "I swear I saw something move." Between the houses, the shadows flickered at the edges of their vision. Ben squinted into the growing darkness. "There, do you see that?" A shape darted across the street between two decaying houses, just out of reach of their flashlights. It was quick, too quick, and the faint outline of a figure seemed to vanish into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. "Ben, we need to leave," Sarah insisted, her panic rising. But it was already too late. The whispers grew louder now, clearer. They no longer seemed to come from the wind, but from all around them, coming from the shadows, from the very walls of the houses themselves. "Leave this place. You shouldn't have come." Sarah could feel the weight of the words pressing against her chest, the suffocating dread that seemed to follow her every step. She spun around, convinced that something, was behind them, but the village remained still, silent, empty. And then, the shadows moved again. Flickers of dark figures darted between the ruined buildings, too fast to catch, their shapes distorted, twisted. The air grew cold, too cold for late summer, and Sarah's breath came out in sharp gasps. "Ben," she screamed. "Where are they coming from?" Ben was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know, but I think they're watching us." Suddenly, a figure appeared, just beyond the edge of their vision. A fleeting silhouette, its face hidden in shadow, standing motionless at the doorway of one of the houses. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispers surged into a cacophony, their voices rising, overlapping, each one more frantic than the last. "You should have left when you had the chance. Now you're ours. We're waiting." Panic surged through Sarah like a tidal wave. She grabbed Ben's arm, pulling him toward the exit. They ran through the village, their hearts pounding in their chests, their feet barely touching the ground as they fled from the unseen terror that stalked them in the dark. But the village was no longer a place. They had crossed into something else, something far more sinister. The houses loomed around them like ancient tombs, their broken windows seeming to leer at them. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, pulling at their very souls. As they finally broke free from the village's grip and made their way back into the forest, they dared to look behind them. But the village was gone. The whispers, the shadows, they had vanished. Yet, in the pit of their stomachs, they both knew one thing for sure. They hadn't just left the village behind. The village had let them go for now, but it was still watching. As the last light of day bled out from the horizon, Sarah and Ben stumbled into the most intact house they had found in the village. The others were dilapidated, their foundations crumbling under the weight of years of abandonment. But this house, despite its age, still seemed eerily preserved. The furniture, though covered in dust, was arranged neatly, almost as though someone had just left for a moment and would return at any time. But it wasn't just the stillness of the house that unsettled them. It was the oppressive silence that hung in the air, like a thick fog that smothered any sound. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, the unease settling in her chest like a heavy stone. Her eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing out of place. Not yet. Ben, his curiosity outweighing his fear, moved to the small wooden table near the far wall. On it lay a book, its pages yellowed and fragile, the leather cover cracked and worn. The title was faded, barely legible, but the word journal could be discerned through the dust. He picked it up, flipping it open with a sense of caution. "Look at this," he said, his voice a little strained as he began reading aloud. This journal belonged to someone in the village. It talked about strange things happening, about a curse. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding in her ears as she read over Ben's shoulder. The words on the pages seemed to unravel the history of the village in ways that chilled her to the core. "It says here the village was founded on an old ritual," Ben murmured, his voice low and unnerving. "A ritual to protect the villagers from something dark. But it went horribly wrong. The villagers weren't offering a sacrifice to protect themselves. They were trapping something that now holds them in a never-ending cycle." As they read further, the details grew darker, more unsettling. The journal detailed how, centuries ago, the village had been cursed by an ancient entity. In an attempt to bind it, the villagers had unwittingly cursed themselves, dooming their souls to eternal torment. They had built the village to keep it locked away, but in doing so, they had condemned themselves to an endless loop of suffering. "They're trapped here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not just gone, they're stuck. Forever." Ben's breath hitched as he turned the page, the words more cryptic and maddening with each sentence. "Each year, they relive their worst fears. Each time the sun sets, they repeat the same tragic fate, over and over," he read aloud, his voice trembling. "But the curse isn't just on them. It's on the land. Anyone who enters will become part of the cycle. They'll be trapped too, forever." The room seemed to grow colder as Sarah stepped back, her feet suddenly feeling heavy, as though the very ground beneath her was trying to hold her in place. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, twisting and shifting as if alive. "Oh my God, Ben. We've disturbed it." Ben slammed the journal shut, his face pale, but he couldn't bring himself to look away from the now darkening room. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the walls like a growing storm. The voices were different this time. They weren't distant and faint. They were close, so close it was as if they were whispering directly into their ears. "You should have left. It's too late for you now. You were part of the curse." Sarah froze. The room, the house, everything seemed to be closing in on them. We need to go. Now." Ben grabbed Sarah's arm and turned toward the door, but when they reached the threshold, they found the doorway gone. The house was now a maze of shadow and shifting walls, the windows no longer leading outside, but to endless voids of black. The curse had already begun. In the distance, beyond the house, the village seemed to stretch and warp. It wasn't just a physical place. It was alive, its twisted form reaching out, pulling them deeper into the nightmare. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with the sound of tortured souls. Figures began to move in the darkness, shadows darting between the houses. Figures that were no longer human, their forms bent and distorted by the curse. "They're coming for us," Sarah screamed, but it was too late. As she turned to flee, the walls of the house shifted, trapping her in a corner. The air grew colder still, and she could feel the eyes of the village on her, watching, waiting. The journal's words echoed in her mind. "Once you've heard the whispers, it's already too late. You were part of the curse. There is no escape." In the dimming light, Sarah and Ben understood the terrifying truth. The village was no longer abandoned. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone to awaken it, and now they would never leave. Panic set in as Sarah and Ben stumbled through the village, their hearts pounding in their chests, breath coming in ragged gasps. Every direction they turned, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, their forms distorting as though the village itself was alive and hungry. "We can't escape," Sarah screamed, her voice trembling with fear. Her legs burned from running, but the village seemed to close in tighter with each passing step. The path ahead blurred, warping like a cruel trick of the mind, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet as if the earth itself had decided to trap them here. Ben glanced back, his eyes wide with terror. "We're going in circles. This is impossible." They had been running for what felt like hours, but no matter how far they went, the village always seemed to reset, leading them back to the same crumbling houses, the same decaying streets. The buildings shifted, their facades morphing, blocking their path with no way through. It was as if the village itself had become a maze, twisting and turning at will. Sarah's chest tightened as she looked around, desperate for any sign of an exit. "It's not real. It can't be real. We're stuck in the curse," Ben finished for her, his voice hoarse. He had read about it in the journal, how the village was bound by an ancient curse, a trap designed to imprison anyone who ventured too close. The villagers had been caught in the endless loop of torment, and now they were too. The whispers of their tortured souls followed them, haunting every corner. "There's got to be a way out. There has to be," Sarah pleaded, but the world around them seemed to mock her every word, the houses leaning in closer, the air thick with the weight of the past. Shadows darted between the buildings, barely visible, yet unmistakably there. Faces appeared at the windows, contorted and distorted in agony. "We need to find the source," Ben said, his voice growing more frantic. The journal said something about breaking the curse, that there was a way, but before he could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed through the streets. Heavy, deliberate, slow, as if something or someone was following them, stalking them from the shadows. The oppressive weight of those footsteps pressed down on them, tightening around their throats like a noose. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, its form hazy and indistinct at first. Then it became clearer, a person, but not a person. It was one of the villagers, or rather, a twisted version of what had once been human. Its eyes were hollow, its skin stretched tight over bones, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at them, its fingers long and skeletal. "You can't escape," it whispered, the voice distorted by years of torment. "You are ours." The couple turned and ran, faster now, their minds racing with the only thought, escape. But no matter how far they ran, the village followed them. It was as though the ground itself turned against them, twisting and contorting, pulling them back toward the same center, the heart of the village, the place where the curse had first been cast. "No," Sarah screamed, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. "We can't go back there. We can't." But it was too late. The path had led them back to the village square, the center where the ritual had once taken place. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and in the center stood the old well, the one from the journal. The well where the villagers had once made their sacrifices, where the curse had been born. Ben looked around, eyes wide with realization. "The well, we have to destroy it." The footsteps grew louder, the shadows closing in, the whispers becoming deafening. The cursed villagers were closing in, their figures shifting and distorting with each step. "Quick!" Sarah cried, her voice laced with panic. "We have to break the curse, before it's too late." They rushed to the well, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, their minds clouded with fear. As they reached the edge, Ben grabbed a nearby stone, the weight of it nearly unbearable. With trembling hands, he hurled it into the well, but nothing happened. The whispering grew louder, closer, until it was all they could hear. "You can't escape." Then, with a sudden crack, the earth beneath them split. A black mist began to pour from the well, swirling upward like a living thing, filling the air with a choking stench. The sky above seemed to crack open, and the village groaned, its walls shifting and warping as if in agony. The curse wasn't just contained in the well, it was in them, in the very air they breathed, in the soil beneath their feet. "Ben!" Sarah cried out, but he had already begun to fade, his body twisting in the air like a marionette caught in the strings of the curse. Her heart pounded as she grabbed his hand, trying to hold on to him, to pull him back, but it was useless. The mist enveloped them both, and the whispers grew louder. "You are one of us now." And then, as if the world itself had decided to swallow them whole, the darkness closed in. The chase was over. They were no longer running. They were trapped, bound by the curse that had claimed so many before them. In the distance, the village continued its endless loop, waiting for the next souls foolish enough to wander into its grip.